If you're a parent, teacher, or school leader, and you're sick and tired of the frustration, anger, and unfair treatment of children at high risk in our public schools, then perhaps it's time for all of us to do something about it. In this podcast, Dr. Amitra Berry brings you tips, tools, strategies, and tactics to build successful solutions while touching, moving, and inspiring all of us to transform our schools so that every child thrives. Here's your host, Dr. Berry.
Welcome back, Equity Warriors. Thanks for tuning in to this special episode. I have a guest today. It is Dr. Richelle Whittaker. She's an educational psychologist, maternal mental health specialist, and author who hosts the Raising Sons podcast. She's committed to empowering families while bridging learning gaps, fostering work-life balance, and championing mental wellness. She has experience as a mother and a working parent. Dr. Whittaker certainly understands the multifaceted challenges that parents encounter. Her impact extends through Providential Counseling and Consulting, her business, supporting schools and families, and Next Steps Coaching and Consulting, another business, where she aids working parents and caregivers. Driven by advocacy, her mission is to amplify the voices of families and create thriving spaces. It is my honor to welcome Dr. Richelle Whittaker to my show. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So we aligned on raising sons. And so let's talk first about your podcast. Every once in a while I mention I have raised one who's now 31. It seems like he may still always be my baby. But talk to us about raising sons.
Sure. So the podcast, so I had another podcast and I just didn't feel like it was, I needed a shift. And so I have sons and this kind of all started with my cousin who is a couple of years younger than me. We were raised together. We went to school together for a little while. He had, at the time, what I didn't know it was that he had ADHD. So we'd be playing and he'd be doing things and his mom would get on him, he'd get a spanking, and then he'd come right back in the room with me and do the same thing again. And I was like, oh my gosh, please stop it, because I do not want you to get in trouble again. And he would go right back to it. And I could not understand why he did that. Well, later on, we found out that he had ADHD. And so he's the sweetest kid. He's a grown man now. He's still very much a sweet man, but ADHD is still something that he has to deal with. And so just going through the course of all of the things that my aunt had to go through and what he had to go through with at the time, because this was dating myself, but 20 or more years ago. So the thing to go to was medication. And there just weren't a lot of resources. And my aunt did try medication, but she said he seemed like a zombie. He just didn't seem like her son. So she took him off. And there just weren't a lot of resources. And so I feel like the trajectory of his life could have been much different had she had more resources and support, had we known more. And so I just kind of took the lamp and made that kind of like my thing. And so because I love him and I think that things could have been very different for him. He also has sons. And so that's kind of like where the whole raising sons, it's shown up in different aspects of my life, but he kind of started it and it's just kind of grown. And so the Raising Sons podcast was birthed from my experience with him as a little girl, trying to keep him out of trouble and trying to make sure he's on the right page. So, yeah.
Interesting. So my son, who is 31, was diagnosed with ADD, no H, just ADD, when he was 5 years old. And I sort of, as an educator and having worked with quite a bit of special ed learners, I knew that there was something going on and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. So I actually, when preschool was not working for him. It just wasn't. And so I stopped teaching and stayed home with him, preschool, kindergarten. When he went to kindergarten, I went with him. I was that parent who sat in the back room and helped the kids in small group and taught them how to tie their shoes and did reading pull out and all of that. And I did everything I could. Again, not, this was 25 years ago, 26 years ago. So we knew very little. And certainly I had no resources. I think had I not been an educator and the child of an educator, I would have done like everybody else and just put him on meds. But I had great teachers. He had phenomenal teachers who said, we are not going to do that. We're going to do everything we can. We did diet. They worked with his grouping in the classroom. But I had the ability and the fortune at that time to be able to say, I'm going to pause my own career and I'm going to go with him to school to make sure he does well. And I know that that is not realistic for most parents.
Hmm.
And it was a truly a lifetime challenge. I think the last time I thought about it as it really, really impacted something was him getting his driver's license, and being able, he did not like being on the meds. Like you said, it was like a
Hmm.
zombie. He didn't feel when he was old enough, and we didn't put him on meds until he was in the fourth grade. Things just got, fourth grade is very different.
Yes.
Um, yeah. And it became more difficult for me to master his environment, so to speak, and keep things working for him. So we did the Ritalin, which was horrible. I think it was as much a nightmare for him as it was for me, probably more so for him. Switched over to Concerta, and that was a little
Hmm.
bit better. But by the time he was 12, he was pretty clear he didn't like being on it. And he's a very creative child. He's an artist. He said he didn't feel like himself. He couldn't write. He couldn't draw. It just didn't work. But I told him, come driver's license time, because he failed the written test 2 times. He said, it's too noisy. They won't let me wear my headphones. I can't concentrate. And there's, I said, you're taking that pill. And then we're going to get that doggone driver's license. And so he's learned as an adult how there are certain times where he may need it, but for the most part, he works really hard to control his own environment. But I think about, especially with our Black boys in schools and the
Hmm.
challenges that we have with education as it is, that for Black boys who are ADD or ADHD, they just have multiple strikes against them if they don't have, and if parents don't have some supports.
I wholeheartedly agree. And being working in the schools as a person who who assessed kids who were suspected of who had a disability, I saw that often that there were, kids, especially boys, they needed um, a different way to learn material. They needed to be able to get up and move around and not have to conform to like sitting in a seat and having to pay attention to the teacher for, minutes on end. It just didn't work for them. And so they ended up oftentimes in these behavior classrooms that only dealt with the behavior. So the education part just kind of got left behind. And so there were often times where I was like, oh, I wish I could say more to the parent about, what I was seeing or experiencing. But at the time when you work for a school district, you are limited on what you can share. But yes, I would agree wholeheartedly that for our Black boys, it impacts their education tremendously. And so we have to do better. When we
Yeah.
know better, we do better.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have to get people to know better. Just in talking about behaviors and this sort of this history of Black boys being funneled into behavior disorder programs, do you see that still as a concern,
I
something
do.
that's happening?
I do.
Why
And it's
why do
not
you suppose that is?
um I think it's because, well, so Black boys, men are notoriously seen in a negative light, and it starts early. We think it's, when they become men, but it really starts early because by the age of 10, Black boys are not seen as their age. They're seen as older than what they are. And so there's this programming, there's this bias that I think that people may not be aware of, teachers may not be aware of that they hold. And so when they come in contact with their student and he's not towing the line, like the other kids in the classroom, it's easier to pathologize him and say that there's something wrong than, trying to settle down and work with him. And, teachers have a lot right now going on, and there's a lot of responsibility that they have just outside of just teaching. But at the same time, if, there's no relationship build or concern outside of maybe what else is going on with this child that could be causing this, then that's what they just kind of are shuttled into this testing. Let's figure out somewhere to get them out of our classroom and somewhere else where I don't have to deal with them.
Yeah. Yeah. I've certainly seen it enough on my own, and I always, whenever they talk about behavior disorder or BD kids, it breaks my heart that particularly Black boys are seen as having behavior disorder when they're not. They're kids, and seen as being threatening because of their
Yes.
physical state. Um, it ticks me off. I'll just bite my tongue for right
Yes.
now. So on your podcast, you talk about parenting topics.
Yes.
What would be, let's say, your top 3 favorite discussions or insights from your show that you'd be willing to share?
Sure. So these were the top three rated episodes. One was how to have difficult conversations with your son. And I think a lot of times, especially for moms who maybe weren't raised around men or boys, you're not really sure how to relate to them. And so I think, that whole conversation about how to have difficult conversations with your son was a popular topic because it's like, okay, I can use this to kind of have conversations with my son around difficult topics or conversations. And that can go all the way from bullying to puberty to dealing with girls to just how to make friends, right?
Yeah.
Those are
I want to
sometimes
say,
those
so
can be difficult conversations.
where were you when my son was an adolescent? And I had, as a divorced mom, and his dad wasn't around enough. And even when he was, he never wanted to handle the difficult stuff. I wish I'd had you then. I have a memory of how do I have the talk about birth control with him as he, got
Hmm.
to that stage. And I said, the only safe sex you can have is the kind you have with yourself. And by the way, your sister brought you a bag of condoms from Planned Parenthood. So here you go. And it was this brown paper bag, a lunch bag filled with condoms. It was like, never do I ever want to hear the words out of your mouth, Mom. I got a girl pregnant. So, and at 31, that still hasn't happened. But I just
Well,
think it's
kudos to you, Mom.
yeah, never been to jail, never been arrested, and he's not gotten anyone pregnant. So yeah, I guess I did something right, but it's a much needed resource. Sorry, I had to jump on that one because the boy that hit me. What's your number 2?
How to help your son deal with puberty. So,
Yeah.
and a couple of weeks ago, I had a brunch for parents that were raising sons, and that was like a highlighted topic even then amongst the parents that were there. So it's interesting that that continues to come up because there are things that are happening to a boy's body that moms just don't know about, and they're like,
Right.
"Oh my gosh!" So yeah, so that was number 2.
Okay. I imagine that the same is true for dads who are raising daughters without a mom
Yes,
around.
right.
And
Hmm.
probably that's a lot less often than, women who are raising their sons, but still a tough challenge. We
Hmm.
don't fully understand their bodies or their brains for that matter.
Yes.
And their thought processes or lack of processes in their brains as they're growing up. And do you have a third one? That was 2, right?
Yes. So the last one was how to show your son affection without babying him. And so that is that happened to me. My son was on a track team and I was getting ready to leave and so I'm telling him, I'm thinking I'm motivating and encouraging him. So I'm like, "Oh, son, you're going to do great." Da 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 and I hug him and he just breaks down and he tells me that I have embarrassed him and I'm thinking, "What?" And so my younger son says, "Yeah, you embarrassed him, Mom. You did all that in front of his teammates." And I'm like, "All I did was try to encourage and support." So I have learned that I need, you back up. And I asked my son after that, I said, "Well, okay, what can I do in public? Like what
Yeah.
is okay?" And he was like, I couldn't dap him up. He was like, I can give him like a side hug. That's all I got.
Okay.
I said, okay. So learning his boundaries
Mhm.
and then taking that upon myself to then implement, right? Not listening to him and saying,
Yeah.
okay, this is how you want me to show you affection. Now, when we're not in front of his friends or his teammates, that's something different. But when we're out in public, he has kind of drawn a line in the sand about how he wants me to show affection. And so I think that happens quite often with moms. I'm doing something I didn't think that it was going to cause that kind of um, frustration or embarrassment, but
Mhm.
clearly it did. So I think that's important to know for moms of how your sons want you to show affection in front of other people.
Yeah. So I guess we just let them lead, as it
Yes,
were.
yes.
I think I sort of backed off early because I mean, again, I spent my life in schools and I kind of knew how middle schoolers were. So once he hit about fifth or sixth grade, I had already backed off and dropped him off at school one day. And he told me to get out of the car, I think it was. And I was like, why? And he gave me a big hug. And I said, okay, well, like, what's the matter? He said, no, I just wanted you to know I love you, that kind of thing. And so he
Oh,
was able to, which, yeah, mama's not a mama's boy. He's not a mama's boy. But I was still thinking at that time that I was going to have to send him to the store and have a locksmith come and change the locks when it was time for him to go. But still, I think to this day, honestly, it's good about showing affection. But I think we have to let them say, maybe
yes.
how they want to show it. Yeah.
And
Interesting.
so, yeah, and I have two very different sons. So my younger son he's 9 now, but like at 7, he's like, "Don't hold my hand in the hallway at school." But my older son was fine holding my hands to class. So when he started freaking out, I'm thinking, what's happening here? Y'all are very different. So it really is person specific. So our boys are not
Yeah.
a monolith. They're not all the same. So yeah.
Yeah. So now I have this. I was just thinking my grandson is 15. He'll be 16 next month. And he will still hug me in public, which, still kind of surprises me because
Hmm.
it's a very different generation than my son was. But yeah. So let them lead. And probably quite a lesson in not only allowing them to lead, but teaching them to lead and being
Yes.
men in that
Hmm.
regard.
Yes, absolutely. Using their voice. That's important.
Yeah. Yeah. So work life, family life, making that balance. Or I had a boss who said, there's no such thing as work life balance, there is work life integration, right? You
Yes.
find a way to make the two work together. So I know that was always challenging for me, mostly because, well, single parent and I traveled for work all the time. So,
Mhm.
what advice do you give to parents to help them find an equilibrium of sorts? Hey there, Equity Warriors. I want to take a quick moment to share something exciting with you. You know how passionate I am about equity in education, right? Well, I've created a special space, a safe space, where we can dive even deeper into these crucial topics. It's our Patreon channel, and I'd love for you to join me there. Here's why it's so awesome. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll get access to exclusive content that I will not share anywhere else. I'm talking additional insights, workshops like you would get in regular professional learning sessions, resources that can really amplify your impact in education. But it's more than just extra content. By subscribing, you are directly supporting our mission. You're helping to create more valuable discussions and resources that you've come to love. You're part of the change we're making in educational systems. And let me tell you, our Patreon community, it is something special. It's a place where passionate educators and advocates can come together, share ideas, and drive real change. So if you're ready to take your commitment to educational equity to the next level, I'd be thrilled to have you join me. Just head over to patreon.com/3E podcast. That's patreon.com/3E podcast. Remember, your support means the world to me, and it helps me continue this important work. Together, we can create the educational system all our students deserve. Thanks for considering, and now let's get back to the episode.
So I don't like the word balance either. I rather say like harmony, right? And so
Mm,
I think it really is about looking at your priorities and whatever is priority at the time, right? So and focusing on that thing for that moment because balance there's it doesn't really exist. You're always a parent, whether your kids are at school or with you, you're always parenting them. And so I think that it's important to have priorities and to know what your values are. So more than likely, your kids are going to come first. But in the course of a work day, you have things that you have to get done. And so you do the first thing that you need to do, the priority, set your priorities, and then do everything else accordingly after that. So, yeah.
yeah, integrate, I suppose.
Hmm.
Um, mental wellness.
Yes.
Yeah, let's talk about mental wellness. Um, I know as a parent, there were times when I just, it's like let me throw him out of the house, or I need to, the old Calgon, take me away, just
Yes.
something. And not from I didn't have a mental health issue, but I know that currently we're seeing more and more challenges with mental health, not just mental
Hmm.
wellness and feeling like we're okay, but those who do also struggle with a mental health issue. And how do you deal with that as a parent, from either regard, either just staying mentally healthy and dealing with all of that, or in dealing with mental health issues, whether it's depression or bipolar disorder or whatever that is, dealing with that and raising children in today's society.
So I think a lot of what we've kind of gotten away from is the village. And so people are isolated in raising families. And I think now more than ever, that takes, no one thinks that raising kids is as maybe they knew this back in the day, but I don't think that people thought about the mental and emotional toil that raising kids takes. And
Mm.
so when you have that community, when you have that village, you're not doing it alone. And so you don't necessarily feel the same amount of pressure because you have some breaks. You have, your children are going to spend time with their grandmother or their aunt that used to live next door, or, even neighbors. And so you're allowed to, take a break or rest. Well, now we're parenting a lot in isolation and we don't have that support. And so I think that is probably the hugest thing, is asking for help. Creating your own village, your own support system, asking for help when it's needed, and taking the help even if it doesn't look like the way that you think it should. Sometimes it's about communicating what you need, but it's also about taking help when it doesn't look like what you thought it would. And so I
Right.
think those things are important. A village and asking for help. I think prioritizing your mental health, right? Knowing that you have to take care of yourself first before you can take care of anybody else. I think that's huge. And a lot of
Mhm.
times we put ourselves on the back burner to make sure that our kids and everybody else is okay. And so our parents need to start putting ourselves first. It doesn't make you selfish, it makes you a better parent. So,
Yeah. I think we are notorious about that. Notoriously
mhm,
notorious that we take care of everyone else. We don't take care of ourselves. Um,
mhm,
and I do believe that we have very much lost our old villages, the village
mhm,
that was just there because we lived in neighborhoods where we grew up, where we knew people,
yes,
where we had family, and our sort of the ability to build wealth, so to speak,
mhm,
and get away from certain places, or simply because it's more of a global economy where we don't live where we grew up because our
right,
jobs are not there, right? So we have,
mhm,
I'm a transplant from California. I moved here with no family, just me. And I had to make new friends in the neighborhood, so to speak. But I don't really live in a neighborhood that's conducive. I live in a high rise, right? So I'm not meeting my
mm,
neighbors out watering the lawn or walking the dog or anything. And more people living that way. I think even my daughter, who does still live in my hometown, but trying to create her own village, which she has managed to do pretty well, raising a son by
mhm,
herself again. But there were so many times where she would call me and she'd just say, Mom, I need a break. Mom, I need a
yeah,
break. And I'm like, well, I'm in Texas. So either you got to put him on a plane and ship him here, or, I'll take him my 2 weeks at Christmas and 3 weeks in the summer. But I think learning to communicate that, I would think,
yes,
especially for younger moms, is
mhm.
probably a bit of a challenge.
Yes, asking for help is huge, and I think because, like you said, we've gotten away from living in community, and we feel like we have to do it on our own. One of the things that I used to hear all of the time when I was doing therapy with moms is my mom, she had, 3 kids, 2 kids, 4 kids, and she didn't struggle. So why am I having a hard time? I just need to get it
Mhm.
together. And so then I'd have to start asking questions about, you don't think your mom struggled, but I have to dig a little bit deeper. And they say, well, I did spend a lot of time with my grandmother. And I'm like, your mom was probably, she needed some time to herself. She was struggling. She didn't communicate that to you, so it didn't look like it, but that's why you were at your grandmother's. And then it's like this light bulb goes off and it's like, oh, okay. So I think asking for help, we're looking at,
Yeah.
role models, grandmothers, aunts, whoever raised us, and thinking, I should be able to do this because they did too, and they didn't ask for help. Well, help for them was already kind of built in.
Yeah.
So, it's about giving ourselves grace. And I don't know that we're the best at doing that.
Well, we also have, you say off to grandma's. With me, it was off to Auntie Vicky's, my
Hmm.
father's oldest sister, who raised him because their mom died very shortly after my father was born, and she was the eldest. So, you took on that responsibility. But man, we were at Aunt Vicky's starting on Friday afternoon after school. We went to Aunt Vicky's, and my mom came and got us on Sunday night. We were there for the weekend every weekend, and I remember I was probably 14 or 15. I told my mom, I don't want to go stay at Auntie's all weekend anymore. Like I have a new social life, and my friends are not in the adult only mobile home park where Aunt Vicky lives. Right. So, but we also have, either we are becoming parents later,
Yeah.
or we are working longer. So,
Hmm.
like, I couldn't be what my daughter would have loved, a stay at home grandma who baked cookies all day long. Get real. I still have a life. I'm not ready for that yet. And my grandson will be 16 next month. So we don't have, I think we're losing, because of the way that we live and work anymore, we're
Yeah.
losing some of that built-in support as well, because women are working outside the home more. We're working later on into our lives. Some of us are some of us delaying having kids until you're, in your 40s or
Yeah.
whatnot. And so, those supports aren't always, or we're not living near family again because we're
Hmm.
moving away to take jobs. So those supports just aren't there. Interesting. Not something I think about until I have the conversation about it.
Yeah. But I mean, you can create your own village. And so I think people
Mhm.
have to kind of open up their mindset about what that looks like. And so, it may not be your grandmother or your aunt. It may be, the daycare could be part of your village, and getting to know the workers who are taking care of your kids, because sometimes they nanny after school or on the weekends. I have a friend who found a in home daycare for her daughter many years ago, and then they became family. That's also something that happened with my parents. My mom found a daycare, in home daycare for me, and then they became part of our family. And so that was, an extension of the village. And so we could go
Yeah.
over there when they needed, time away or had something to do. And so I think it doesn't always have to look like we think it does. It doesn't always have to be family. It can grow
Right.
from, like I said, in home daycare or a neighbor or something like that. So
Yeah. We have to create those systems. And we also can't send our kids outside to play in traffic like we used to back when I was a kid.
no.
It doesn't work. If I grew up at a time when it was like, you be home before those street lights come on. And now we don't want our kids to venture further than the front yard very often.
Hmm.
So yeah, we have a different type of work to do in creating
Yeah,
those systems. I
we
want to
do.
hear about your books just a little bit. I want my listeners to hear about your books. You have two: Burps,
Yeah.
Bibs, and Breakdowns. I had to practice saying that: Burps, Bibs, and Breakdowns, and then Embracing What's Next. Talk to us.
So the Burps, Bibs, and Breakdowns was created because it was something I wished I'd had. So when I had my son, I experienced postpartum depression, and it was very hard to communicate that. I knew what it
Mhm.
was, because I was a therapist and because I was kind of dwelling into that area. But at the same time, I had these fears around, if I said something, then they would take my baby, and
Mm.
all of these things. And so what I realized was, a lot of women, especially Black and brown women, have these same fears. And so it keeps them silent. And the silence it keeps you stuck, and it keeps you in this whole uh reel of shame and all of the things. And so the journal was created to help moms to kind of focus on their mental health in that early stage of after having a baby, because a lot of attention goes to the baby. And so making sure that they're okay, taking time to check in with themselves, and then figuring out that if they are feeling like this, that they can, seek out help. And so that's the kind of the reasoning behind that journal. And then Embracing What's Next is a journal for parents during once they have a child that has been diagnosed with a disability. There's this whole tailspin that happens, and a lot of times what happens is, parents what I've seen parents do is one of two things. They either go 100% toward trying to cure their child, or they do nothing. And so, because they're stuck in that grieving process. And so, what I've seen is there's not been anything to help them move through that grieving process. And so, the journal spends 15 days with you, asking yourself why, you writing down all of these things. And then the latter 15, reframing those questions so that you can move out of, inaction and grief into action, and looking at it from a different vantage point. Like, it's not the end of the world. It could be, this great thing. Not to say that's not going to have challenges, but how we perceive something has a lot to do with what our experience is.
That's awesome. So you do a lot of advocacy as well, right? Sort
Yes.
of advocacy is at the core of the work that you do. Um, and I'm going to ask you one more question after this, but that kind of will tie to that. But how is it, or what would you say to parents, or what would be the best way, easiest way for parents and caregivers to become advocates for their children, either in their education or their overall well being?
So I would say, in terms of education, it's reading, right? So, if your child has been diagnosed with a disability, you have parent rights, and their procedural rights and safeguards that are given to you pretty much at every meeting and at the start. And so, knowing that, reading it and understanding what your rights are from reading that is a good start, because you can't, if you don't know anything, you can't do anything about changing or advocating for your
Right.
child. So I would say start there. In terms of mental wellness, we are in a great place, right? Because we have so many different things. We have social media, we have YouTube, we have all kinds of things that are out there. So, in terms of mental wellness, maybe it's finding somebody who you trust, that are speaking your language, that you gravitate towards, and or creating these schedules that kind of help you stay in balance. And I'm using that word again. When I say imbalance, I mean kind of helping you to kind of stay together mentally well. So that might be working out, that might be, making sure you're staying on top of your doctor visits, doing all the things that pour into you, and staying on top of that in terms of mental wellness for you. So I would say, and making sure that you understand what is happening with yourself, right? So that you can
Mhm.
then be the best parent that you can be.
Okay. And for those, reading is really literacy is at the core of the work that I do. And so I'm always concerned or cognizant that, well, a lot of times we'll have parents. I think about parents that I sat in IEPs with who couldn't read their rights. Are there, I know that you're based here in Houston, but are there channels that people can go to, places where they can find support in the areas that where they live, so that if they do struggle with literacy themselves, or they don't understand the rights that they've been given, that someone else can help advocate for them for their child at school?
Sure. You just have to ask. Most of the time, the evaluators who have evaluated your child, they want you to advocate for your child. And so they're more than willing most times to help you to understand what the rights are. The people that work in special education, the teacher or the department chair, they will take time and sit with you and kind of explain to you, what your rights are. Right now, I believe with the invention of social media and all of like these recordings, they're all kind of podcasts too that you can listen to. And they're also recordings, I believe, of the parent rights that you can listen to if, if you struggle with reading, so that you can understand what it is that so you can understand what your child's rights are, what your rights are.
Okay, so I'm gonna make that like a little bit of my homework and try and find a couple of those and put some links down in the notes from this show for folks.
Okay.
And I did say I was only gonna ask you one more question, but that question I just asked was not that one more question. Last question is, when I sign off my podcast, I say, don't worry about the things you cannot change, change the things you can no longer accept. And I sort of steal that thought from Dr. Angela Davis. So I would like to ask you, what is the one thing that you cannot accept? And then what can listeners do to support changing whatever that is?
So one of the things I would say, probably the one thing that I cannot accept is that our boys are not looked as human. There's not viewed as, is that the word, human? Having emotions and feelings. And that's
Mhm.
the one thing that I can't I cannot accept. And so, I would say, in supporting me in that, like I said, we have these sometimes brunches, we have the podcast, so tune into the podcast, download it, listen to it. If you're in the area when we have these brunches and activities that are happening, join us, get part of the, become part of the conversation. And so, yeah, that's how you can support me in that work.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, my guest today has been Dr. Richelle Whittaker. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. I'm going to make sure that her contact information and full bio are down in the notes so that you can follow her podcast as well. Dr. Whittaker, thanks for joining me. It's been lovely and enlightening and educational and a whole bunch of other things.
Thank you for
And
having me.
And Equity Warriors, if you know a parent or caregiver with a child who could benefit from hearing Dr. Whittaker's message or living in the greater Houston, Texas area and could benefit from the services that her businesses offer, send them this podcast and send them the notes down below as well. As for your local schools, you know the deal. Get involved. Stay involved. Make sure you're voting in your local elections, especially for your school boards, and then attending those local school board meetings, particularly if you have a concern that needs to be raised. Advocate through social media. Follow me across channels, like, share, subscribe. Continue to join me every week. Connect with me on social. Send me your questions, topics, and requests to info@askdrbarry.com. Of course, I will answer those and bring you guest experts like Dr. Whittaker to address those topics. Don't worry about the things you cannot change. Change the things you can no longer accept. And I'll see you next time.
That's it for today's episode of the 3E Podcast. Head over to iTunes and subscribe to the show. One lucky listener every single week that posts a review on iTunes will win a chance in a grand prize drawing to win a $25,000 value private VIP day with Dr. Barry herself. Be sure to head over to 3epodcast.com and pick up a free copy of Dr. Barry's gift. Then join us on the next episode.